Today's daf is daf Lamed Zayin. And we'll begin with Lo Cholzin on the top of daf Lamed Zayin. The Mishnah categorizes the Isurei Shvus, the Drabbanans of Yontif, into three categories. And this we saw in the Mishnah daf Lamed Vav Amid Beis. The first category was just plain Shvus, then there was Rishus, and then there was Mitzvah. And it says, Lo Cholzin v'lo miyab, that Chalitza and Yibum are classified as Rishus. So the Gemara objects, Mitzvah ka'avid. The Torah commands a brother who survives his late brother, who had died without children and left a wife, to be miyabim his brother's wife, and that's a mitzvah. Why do you classify it as a rishus? Lo tzricha de'ika gadol, mitzvah begadol liyabim. If there are a number of brothers that survive the late brother, then the mitzvah falls. The primary mitzvah is an obligation incumbent upon the oldest of the brothers, oldest of the live brothers. And our Mishnah is addressing a case where the Yibum was not implemented by the oldest of the brothers, and therefore it's less of a mitzvah, and the Mishnah indicates that it's less of a chiyuv by calling it a rishus. Now, with regard to those shvusim that apply to rishus, the Gemara asks, "V'kulum time of mind." Why did the Rabbanan enact these shvusim? Like, for example, we have lo donim, there's no judgment on Yontif, there's no kiddushin on Yontif, there's no chalitza, there's no yibum. And the Gemara answers that they all fit under one underlying category. We're afraid that if, let's say, there's a judgment, somebody may be tempted inadvertently to commit that ruling to writing. Or, for example, in the case of chalitza, they would always give the choletzes, called the shtar chalitza. And that would be proof in her hands that she can marry anyone because she received chalitza. In the case of yibum, they would write what's called a shtar ksuba, because even in the case of yibum, you have to give your wife a ksuba. And we're afraid that maybe somebody would forget that it's yontif and write down a document, a shtar ksuba. In the case of kiddushin, obviously, there are three ways you can be mekadesh each, one of them is through shtar. So the temptation was to write a shtar after the kiddushin. And therefore, in all these cases called rishus, the Mishnah indicates that these shvusim apply even on yontif. Now we have the last category in the Mishnah, ve'elehem mishum mitzvah, lo makdichin, v'lo marichin, v'lo machrivin, which are all forms of hegdish. And to be magdish something is a mitzvah. When you designate and you consecrate something for the Beis HaMikdash, that's a mitzvah. And you can do it in different ways, through hegdish, through haracha, where you say erko alai, or cherem. In all these cases, the Gemara says, there's a transfer of ownership from private ownership to the ownership of hegdish. A lot of people don't realize that hegdish is a company, so to speak, that has ownership. And by transferring ownership over to hegdish, you're doing something which is absolutely similar to mekach u'memkar, to buying and selling. And by taking something out of your rishus and transferring it to the rishus of hegdish, that's another form of mekach u'memkar, which is asur on yontif. Now, why itself is mekach u'memkar prohibited on yontif? Rashi claims that this is a doraisa. It's derived from a pasuk, and mekach u'memkar is not an appropriate activity and speech for yontif. A day that's sanctified, its speech has to be very unique. However, Rashi offers another interpretation that even mekach u'memkar fits under the same category that we had before of Shemi Yichtov, that they would write a shtar and give that document into the hands of the buyer so that he could prove that he paid good money and therefore it's rightfully his. And the Mefarshim say that Rashi wanted to offer the possibility of a doraisa and not suffice with the explanation of Shema Yichtov Shtar Mecher, because Rashi says that we have here a gzera l'gzera. Why? Because there's no reason why we should prohibit hegdesh, except for the fact that it might be confused with mekach u'memkar, but mekach u'memkar itself is d'rabbanan. So you're talking about a gzera onto a gzera, and therefore Rashi offers us an alternative interpretation that it's derived from the pasuk v'davar dava, which gives it an upgraded status of a doraisa. The Mishnah continues and says, "Lo magbiyan trumas u'maisus." The Gemara asks pshita. We have a thing which is called tikkun kli, and that's a prohibition on yontif. You cannot set up a vessel or utensil that beforehand was not functional, you couldn't benefit from it, and now you do something to complete that vessel. That's prohibited on yontif. And certainly in the case of trumas and maisros, we have something, a foodstuff, which cannot be eaten. You cannot enjoy a benefit of it unless you're mafresh trumas and maisros. So the Gemara answers, there's a special chiddush in our Mishnah. Honey, Rav Yosef quoted a brayso, "Lo nitzucha ela litna lekohen bo bayom." We're talking about a case where, although you're absolutely forbidden from being mafresh, perhaps you can set up a frasha, this is the havamina, in the following way. Do it in a way where it's not nikar, it's not clear that you're doing it for the purpose of tikkun tevel. Why? Because immediately after you were mafresh chumas and maisros, you brought it to the kohen. Now, when people see you bringing something to the kohen, they don't know that this is a truma meiser hafrasha. They think that he's being molech truma to the kohen, and that's all he did on this yom. He did not implement a hafrasha of trumas and maisros. He's only being molech it and bringing it as a gift to the kohen, and therefore I would have thought that in such an ofen, in such a case, there's no Isra Afracha. The Mishnah wants to teach me that even so, even though the spectator will assume he's just being molech the truma to the kohen, nevertheless, the Afracha itself was absolutely forbidden. The Gemara says the following: there is a way of setting up a permissible Hafracha on Yontif. How so? When do we say you're not allowed to be mafresh trumas and ma'is? That's only peri de tefile be'esmo. That already on erev yontif they had the status of tevel, and we say that there's no reason to allow you to be mafresh on something that you could have been mafresh before yontif. Avol peri de tefile ha'idna. The Gemara is going to give an example where it became tevel today on yontif. There was no possibility of being mafresh on erev yontif because it wasn't tevel. Gigon. What is the case? Isa, if you take flour and you add water and you knead it as a dough, and it only became tevel on yontif when you made the dough. In such a case, mafrishin via vina lekohen, we're allowed to be mafrish challah on yontif and give it to the kohen because he had no possibility of being mafrish on erev yontif. It was not tevel at that. And Gemara asks a question on this distinction that the Mishnah makes between two categories, one mishum rishus and the other mishum mitzvah. So the Gemara asks, "V'hani mishum rishus ika mishum shvus leka." Why are you telling me that you have three categories? You have number one mishum shvus, number two mishum rishus, number three mishum mitzvah, as if to imply that in the cases of Mishum Rishus and Mishum Mitzvah, we don't have Shvus. That's not possible. Shvus is the underlying common denominator of all three categories. V'hani Mishum Mitzvah Ika Mishum Shvus Leka. Why did the Mishnah differentiate between Shvus and Mitzvah? Even in the case of Rishus, even in the case of Mitzvah, we're dealing with a Shvus. Rabbi Yitzchak, the way you read the Mishnah is lo mi boy kama. Lo mi boy always means when the Mishnah wants to tell you the lesser Chiddush first and then move on to a greater Chiddush. Lo mi boy come. Lo mi boy shvus great dasa. It goes without saying that a shvus, which has no element of neither reshus nor mitzvah, like riding a horse, such a thing is asur on Yontif. It's a shvus that's just great dasa. Great dasa means that all it has is the isur. Ella, the Mishnah wants to tell you, afilu shvus the reshus, even something that has ktsas mitzvah, that has some element of mitzvah to it, like the case of Yibum in one of the younger brothers. Nami asur, that too is asur. And not only that, I'm going to tell you even a bigger thing. Lo mi boy shvus the reshus the asur, afilu shvus the mitzvah nami asur. Even in a case where there's a full-fledged mitzvah, and we're going to discuss that case soon, even that's asur, and the Rabbanon insisted on observing the Shvus on Yontif, despite the fact that you would give up on a mitzvah. The Mishnah says, Kol elu b'Yontif amru, ein bein Yontif l'Shabbos ela ochel nefesh b'lvad. The final clause in our Mishnah summarizes that there's no difference between Yontif and Shabbos. All Shvusim are common to both Shabbos and Yontif, and the only difference is when you do a malacha for the purpose of food. So the Gemara asks for a minu. How can you tell me this? This is not true. This is not an accurate description. We had a Mishnah earlier on Daf Lamed Hey, and the Mishnah says, Mashilin derech aruba b'yontif avalo b'Shabbos. The Mishnah says that we don't want to get involved in tircha by carrying things and relocating them, heavy things, and so forth and so on. And on Shabbos, that's asur. On Yontif, though, we have a special kula that we allow you, in order to protect your fruits from the rains that might ruin it, and they're on the gag, they're on the roof, you're allowed to send them down through the skyline. But here you see clearly a difference between Yontif and Shabbos. Why is that omitted here now? Rabbi Yosef Lokash, or Rabbi Eliezer, or Rabbi Yoshua. Our Mishnah holds that anything that the Rabbanon enacted as a gzeira on Shabbos, they included Yontif as well, even in a situation where the person will suffer a loss, a financial loss. That Mishnah reflects the shita of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer is more machmir with regard to Yontif, even in a case of Hefsed Mammon, as we'll see. When I say he's more machmir, I mean relative to Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua would insist that the heter of Hashalas Peiros B'Yontif is because of Hefsed Mammon. And in the mindset of Rabbi Yeshua, Hefsed Mammon, a financial loss, is very significant, and it gives you license to do a tircha in the case of Mashil. So that the earlier Mishnah reflects the Shita Rabbi Yeshua, who is Mekil on Yontif in a case of Hefsed Mammon. But Rabbi Eliezer would not be lenient, even for the sake of protecting you from financial loss, with regard to Yontif. And therefore, Rabbi Eliezer would say that Mashilin, which is a tircha, is prohibited on Yontif. Where do we find the original source for a machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua? And that is the Sanya in the Beitza. Oso v'es b'no. You're not allowed to shech a parent and the offspring. This is derived in Vayikra Chav Beis from the pasuk V'shar Oseh Oso v'es b'no lo sishkatu b'yom echad. On one day, you're enjoined from shechting both the parent and the offspring. And now what happened was that Oso b'no v'es b'no, two animals, one was the father, one was the child, one was the mother, one was the child. Naflu lebar, they fell to the bottom of a pit. And that's a very dangerous situation because the animal could die in the bottom of the pit that has no resources, no water, etc., no food. And the question is, would we allow him to haul up the two animals from the bottom of the pit? And that would be, on the one hand, a tiltul litzarech, and on the other hand, a tiltul shalol litzarech. One of these two animals he's going to shecht on Yontif, so that's called tiltul litzarech. the other he's not going to be able to shech because the Torah enjoins him from shechting both the parent and the offspring on the same day. So Rabbi Eliezer Omer, you have no choice. Malas Rishon, you can only haul up one of the two animals, Almanas L'Shofto, and that tiltul is permissible because it's a tzarech hakol nefesh, the shofto. What are you going to do with the other animal that's dying of starvation at the bottom of the pit? Hasheni oselo parnosa bimkom. We'll have some sort of pulley system, and we'll lower down food into the bottom of the bar, so kadesh lo yomos, that the animal should stay alive. However, notice that Rabbi Eliezer will no way, no how allow you to haul up both animals. And that's a chumrah in contrast to Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua Omer, you're allowed to haul up both animals. How? Through what's called ha'arama. Okay, I'm going to write this on the board because this is a major concept. Ha'arama. And loosely translated into English as subterfuge, meaning finding a way of circumventing the law. And Rabbi Yeshua is going to employ a subterfuge in order to allow you to carry up both animals from the bottom of the bar. Rabbi Yeshua Malas Rishon Almanas L'Shofto, he hauls up one animal to shech, the Vieno shofto, but he doesn't shech. V'chozer umarim, he goes back and he does this harama. And what does he say? He makes a declaration that, you know what, I'm not satisfied with the first animal. It's a skinny, lean animal. And on Yom Tov, I want to shech a more healthy animal. Umalas hasheni. And then he hauls up the second animal in the hope that the second animal is not lean, but fat. At the end of the day, we're going to allow him to shech whichever one he wants. He can't shech both of them because of also Espino. But you see that Rabbi Yeshua is being makil with regard to the Yisurim of Yom Tov for the sake of Hefsed Mama, because it's very possible that the other animal left on the bottom of the bar will die, despite all our efforts to try to keep him alive. Amalei Abaye turns to Rabbi Yosef, Kedarko Bakodesh, and he says, it's not a fair interdependence. They're two independent issues. Dilma. Why is Rabbi Eliezer Machmir in the case of two animals at the bottom of the bar? He has faith that will be able to keep the other animal alive and well. We'll be able to sustain it by sending food down. And therefore, he doesn't consider this a case of Hefsed Mama. But in the case of Mashilin, where the rains are going to come down and they're going to ruin the payros, even Rabbi Eliezer would allow it. There's no way that you can keep these payros protected unless you send them down through the aruba. Lo, Rabbi Eliezer did not object, and he would permit being machilin as a payros. Inami. Now I want to show you the flip side that you have no proof about Rabbi Yeshua. I can't look over Rabbi Yeshua. When does Rabbi Yeshua allow you to haul up both animals from the bar and Ki'ilu be making on Yom Tov? No. That's not a kula of Yom Tov. That's halach of harama. And Rabbi Yeshua maintains that harama is a valid methodology that is validated by the halacha. In the case of Asholas Peiros, there's no possibility of doing harama. He's obviously doing whatever he can to save the peiros, and he wants to eat them on Yom Tov, is low. Then Rabbi Yeshua would agree that there's no head. El Omer of Papa. So Rav Papa now has to offer an alternative answer because we've just rejected the answer that Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua. So we're still left with the stira about whether we are more Mekil and Yom Tov or we're not Mekil and Yom Tov. Now Mishnah seems to indicate that there's no room for Kula and Yom Tov except for Ochel Nefesh, whereas the Mishnah Mashilin allows Mashilin on Yom Tov and not on Shabbos. Lo kasha ha Beit Shammai ha Beit Hillel. We're going to now find that Beit Shammai are more machmir with regard to Yom Tov than Beit Hillel. This is a Mishnah we learned on Daf Yud Beis. Beit Shammai Omer Mein Motziin Lo Es HaKatan V'Lo Es HaLulav V'Lo Es HaSefer Torah L'Reshus HaRabim. In other words, according to Beit Shammai, anything that's not specific for achila, even though you need it for a mitzvah, we're not going to allow you to do a meleches hotzol or chisarabim from chisarabim for the sake of that mitzvah. We need ochel nefesh. There's no heter and yontif for any malach that's not ochel nefesh. Beisil matirin, because Beisil have, if you recall, a principle called mitov. And once the Torah allows a malacha for the purpose of ochel nefesh, Beisil expands the scope of that heter to include even shalol litzarach ochel nefesh. In any event, we see clearly that Beit Shammai are more machmir in hotzah on yontif, and a hotzah which is carried from Rosh Hashanah not for the purpose of ochel nefesh is prohibited, whereas Beit Hillel will allow it. So in the framework of Beit Shammai's Chumrah, where a hotzah shalol litzarach is asur, that means that the tiltul is considered like an exertion. It's almost like a tircha. And what are you doing with this tiltul? You're taking a katan out and a sefer Torah and so forth, and it's not for the purpose of ochel nefesh. Such a tircha of tiltul, hakatan, halulav, or hasefer, according to Beit Shammai, is prohibited, and likewise, the tiltul of hasholas peros is prohibited, to send down the fruits from the roof. However, Beis Hillel, who allow haltzah even shalol litzarech, in the case of katan, sefer Torah, and lulav, is tiltul shalol litzarech in the case of mashilin, even though he might not be able to eat all those peros, he's really just protecting it from the elements, is mutter. So Gemara once again rejects. Below, perhaps there's no analogy here. Ad kan lo kami Beit Shammai osam. When do Beit Shammai say that we have to be more machmir? In the case of hotzah, ela ahotzah. That's because we're talking about a malacha d'oraisa. He's carrying the katan or the lulav, etc., from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah. But aval tiltul, in the case of a tircha, that you're carrying the fruits in order to send them down through the aruba, lo, Beit Shammai would not be machmir. They would allow you the tiltul shalol litzarach yontif, shalol litzarach ochel nefesh, for the sake of protecting your peros and preventing a loss of. And hasholas peros min hagag would be mutter according to Beit Shammai. And that's the Gemara's objection here to the statement of Rav Papa. How do you know that Beit Shammai would be more machmir than Beis Hillel in the case of hasholas peros? Hasholas peros is only tiltul. He's not carrying anything from reshus to reshus. So the Gemara answers, "Atu tiltul lav tzarich hotzahu." Gemara asks with a kind of rhetorical question: is it not so that tiltul is prohibited because it's the beginning of hotzah? Any gzera prohibiting tiltul, if it's shalol litzarach yontif, is only because of hotzah. We're afraid once we allow you to carry something, you might carry it out from your house into reshus or rabbim. So since Beit Shammai are of the opinion that hotzah shalol litzarach, if it's not expressed explicitly for the purpose of eating, it's asura. So too, according to Beit Shammai, we should make a gzera that we should prohibit tiltul shalol litzarach, because the whole thrust of the gzera d'Rabbanan in tiltul is because of hotzah. And this leads us to the Mishnah on the bottom of Daf Lamed Zayin. From this point and on, we're going to be spending a lot of time, not just on Daf Lamed Zayin, but also on Lamed Ches, on the laws of Eruvin. So just to give a little bit of a background as to the laws of Eruvin that are relevant to our sugya, a person who wants to leave what's called the tchum, the outer boundaries of the city, for example, if he lives in an urban area, is prohibited in the absence of an Eruv from walking 2,000 amma or more outside of the city limits. You set up the boundaries of the city, you count 1,000 and then another 1,000, all told 2,000 amma. That's as far as we allow you to go, unless you make an Eruv. Now, the Eruv is based on a concept called Kinyan Shvisa. And the word Shvisa means a resting place. A Kinyan is usually an acquisition, and in a certain loose connection here, it's not exactly a precise analogy, but you are acquiring a makom shvisa. You're saying, this is where I am shows. Everything depends on bein hashmashos, meaning, where were you when the sun set on Friday afternoon or an Erev Yontif? Wherever you were, wherever you're located, that's called X. That's a location which is called makom kinyan shvisa. And from that point and on, you're allowed to go 2,000 am, unless you set up an Eruv. Now, the concept of Kinyan Shvisa is relevant, in addition to how far you're allowed to walk, to how far you're allowed to carry your vessels, any sort of kelim, begadim, clothing. And just like there's halacha of Kinyan Shvisa with regard to your own body, there's halacha of Kinyan Shvisa with regard to kelim. And that enjoins you from taking the kelim anywhere beyond the allotted circumference of an area that you're allowed to walk in. So wherever you're allowed to walk, that's where you're allowed to take the kelim. And again, as we said before, we will measure 2,000 am. We'll put a point which represents a location, and that's where he was Kona Shvisa at the moment of the entry of Shabbos. And then we'll create a circumference, a circle of 2,000 amma in every single direction. That's the maximum he could go. That's the maximum he could take his kelim on Shabbos or Yontif in the absence of an Erev Tchumen. Now, if he has an Erev Tchumen, so then in addition to 2,000 amma, he can be Kona Shvisa at the 2,000 amma point, and then by setting up Mazon Tvei Sudos, and then we give him another 2,000. So he gains from 2 to 4,000 amma. The Mishnah says, "Habehema v'akelim kiragle habaylim," that if you want to relocate utensils or animals, you are bound by the same limitations as the ragle, the feet of the bailim. Wherever the bailim, the owner of the animal or the kelim, is allowed to walk, that distance is permissible in order to take the animal or the kelim for a walk and relocate them. Now, what happens if a person, instead of owning an animal and purchasing it, he borrows it? That's called she'ela. If he borrows a behema or kelim, then he's not the owner of it, but yet, since he has rights to use it, the owner sort of like gives up his das, meaning he's not connected to that animal or kelim that he lent to someone on Erev Yontif, Erev Shabbos, and therefore now the shoel becomes like the kohen, and we're going to restrict it based on the shoel, wherever he's located and where he was kohen. However, let's assume that the she'ela or the kinyan took place on Yontif itself. Then everything goes by the ragle habaylim. Why? Because we go back, as we said, to bein hashmashos, and the owner of these kelim or this behema, where was he on Erev Shabbos, on Erev Yontif? Where was he Kona Shvisa? And even if on Yontif itself you lend out the kelim or the animal, nevertheless, there is an absolute prohibition in going beyond the allotted tchum of the bailam, of the owner. Unless, as I said before, the she'ela, the kinyan had taken place Erev Yom Tov, and then there's a new bailam. HaMoser behemto libno olaroa. On Yom Tov, the owner of the animal transferred the animal over to the hands, the domain of his son or a shepherd. Hare elu kiragli abayim. The son or the shepherd is limited to the area, that circumference, that was set with regard to this behema on Erev Shabbos, Erev Yom Tov Ben Hashmashos. Because at that point in time, there was no transfer of the animal over to the ben or the roan, and therefore it's kiragle habaylim. So that now, if the ragle habaylim are limited, so too, when the animal is in the possession now on yontif of the ben or the roa, the location of the animal, or I should say the leeway for relocating the animal, is restricted by the restricted area of the bailam. Now, what happens, asks the Mishnah, if you have partners, or in this case, brothers that inherited kalim, and even if they didn't divide up the estate, but they may have in mind that one of the brothers will get exclusive use of this object, and quid pro quo, another brother will get exclusive use of another object. Kalim amiyuchadim li echad min ha'achim shebabayis. Now we know that this particular kli is designated exclusively for one of the brothers in the household. Hare elu kiragla. Then we determine the leeway for relocating the object by the konesh, the kinyan shvisa of this particular brother to whom the object was designated for use. Where was he entering into Yom Tov? So that if one of the other brothers wants to take that kli beyond the circumference, the tchum of the brother for which the kli is miyuchad, they're not allowed to do so. B'she'ein miyuchadim, if on the other hand you have kalim that are used by all the brothers, they were never divvied up in any way, in any designated for any particular brother. Harelu kid makom shaholchin, meaning you're only allowed to take the kalim to a place where all the brothers are allowed to go. If there's a place, a location where one of the brothers is excluded from, he's limited. Like, for example, let's say one of the brothers set up an Eruv at the end of 2,000 am on the northern side of the city. He's allowed to go 4,000 am towards the north, but he's not allowed to go towards the south at all because he was going to shvisa 2,000 amas to the north, and we'll give another 2,000 amas, so we have 4,000 amas. The other brothers did not make such an Eruv. But since one of the brothers is now limited, he can't go south, so therefore none of the brothers are allowed to take those kalim south, because those kalim are designated for all the brothers, and therefore we're going to be limited by that brother that limited, whichever brother it is. The Mishnah continues, Hashoel kli mechaver me'erev yontif, kiragle hashoel. If you borrow a kli before yontif, then you are the so-called bailim, because all the tashmishim, all the uses of the object are now dedicated, are now singularly yours. But beyond if on the other hand, on yontif you borrow a kli, kiragle hamashli, you're only permitted to take that kli as far as the mashil, meaning the owner, is concerned, where he was konesh shvisa. V'chein ha'isha sheshola mechaverta tavlid umayim umelach le'isa. So too, if a woman on yontif borrows from her neighbor, her friend, spices, water, salt, all the ingredients that have to go into the flour to make a dough out of it, hare elu kiragle shteyan. In other words, both the mashil and the shoeles, right, both the owner and the one who borrowed it, are not allowed to take this tavchil or this isa Anywhere beyond, anywhere where the two of them are not allowed to go. It has to be an area that overlaps both of them. Why? Because since the She'ela took place on Yontif, that means that Bein Hashmashos, they were, this Kemach, or the Isa, the dough, was in the hands of the Masheles, right, the original owner. Therefore, the Shoeles, is limited by the area of the owner. Rabbi Yehuda, in a case, says Rabbi Yehuda, where she borrowed mayim in order to add it to the tavshil or the isa, and this took place on Yom Tov, the mayim did not prevent her, inhibit her from taking that pot or that dough to a place where she is allowed to go, even though the masheles, the owner, is not allowed to go that far. Why? Because mayim ein lehem mamash. And the Tanakama says that since you use the mayim in a context with salt and flour and so forth and so on, it becomes part of the isa. It's considered davar sheish.